I woke up to a sound that didn't belong in my quiet neighborhood, a grinding, tearing roar that made the walls of my house vibrate. For a moment, half asleep, I thought it was thunder, but the sky outside my window was clear. When I heard the metal scrape again, sharp and violent, I jumped out of bed and ran to the door barefoot. The morning air slapped me awake, cold against my skin, and the sharp smell of freshly torn mud hit me so hard it tightened my throat. I followed the noise around the side of the house, heart pounding, and then I froze. Two men with shovels were carving a trench down the side of my property. A third stood on a small machine, its metal claw ripping through my yard, throwing chunks of dirt into piles. My grass, the fence line, the stone border I'd built myself, completely torn apart like it meant nothing. My first words caught in my chest, coming out half broken. "What are you doing on my property?" None of the workers answered. One didn't even bother turning his head. But someone else did. From the street, stepping out of a white SUV with that slow, deliberate walk she used when she wanted to look important, came Linda Carver, our HOA president. Tall, stiff posture, hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, expression already annoyed like I had inconvenienced her by existing. She approached me as if she'd been waiting for this moment. "Michael," she said, her voice clipped, "this is community drainage work. The board approved it. Don't interfere." I stared at the trench again, at the direction it ran, straight toward the slope that led down to my crawl space. Water from the entire street would flow exactly where she was carving. I took a few steps closer, forcing the workers to stop. "This is my property line," I told her, pointing at the wooden stake still visible in the ground. "You can't dig here." Linda didn't even look. "We have the authority to make improvements for community benefit. The water needs somewhere to go." "Onto my home?" I asked, voice rising despite my attempt to stay calm. She crossed her arms. "Onto unused space behind your home." The way she said it, cold, dismissive, rehearsed, made something sink inside my chest. She didn't slip. She knew exactly what she was doing. She wanted this ditch here. She wanted the water redirected. And she wanted me powerless. The machine roared again behind me as the operator waited for Linda's signal. Neighbors started stepping out onto porches, whispering among themselves, eyes darting between me and the trench. None of them spoke. None stepped forward. They knew how Linda handled anyone who questioned her. Letters, fines, threats. And I could feel her watching me, almost daring me to make a scene she could use against me later. I took one more step forward. "Show me the approval. Show me anything with my signature." Linda's smile didn't reach her eyes. She lifted a manila folder just enough for me to see a label on the front before she tucked it tight under her arm. My stomach dropped the second I read it. "Pre-approved project. Read property." For a moment I couldn't hear the machinery, the voices, the movement. All I could hear was my heartbeat pounding in my ears as I realized this wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate, planned. And that folder had my name on it. The moment I saw my name on that folder, something inside me snapped. Before Linda could tuck it fully under her arm, I leaned forward and snapped a quick photo with my phone. She recoiled instantly, pulling the folder back like it was something fragile, but I already had the proof. My name. My property. My supposed approval. My hands were shaking as I lowered the phone, a mix of anger and disbelief twisting inside my chest. I had never signed anything. Never agreed to anything. The shock hit me harder than the sound of the machinery ripping through my yard. For a second, everything around me blurred, and my mind slipped back to the day I moved into this neighborhood. I remembered carrying boxes from the truck when Tom Miller walked over with that easy smile and a toolbox in his hand. "Welcome to Ridgeview Estates," he had said, offering to help me set up the washer. His wife Rachel joined us minutes later with a plate of cookies, laughing as their dog ran circles around my porch. They were warm, genuine, the kind of neighbors you hope for when you buy a home. But I also remembered how the mood shifted when Rachel lowered her voice and said, "Just watch out for Linda." Tom nodded quietly beside her. "She likes to run things her way." Back then, I didn't understand what that meant. I assumed it was normal HOA strictness. I had no idea how deep her control went. Over time, little stories surfaced. A man fined for having his porch light too bright. A woman forced to repaint her fence 3 times because Linda didn't like the shade. A veteran down the street threatened with penalties because he wanted to put a small flagpole in his own yard. Every complaint followed the same pattern. Linda twisting rules, stretching authority, pushing boundaries until people were too tired or scared to fight back. I used to think they exaggerated. Now, watching my yard being torn apart, I knew they hadn't even scratched the surface. The sound of metal scraping snapped me back to the present. I stepped closer to the trench, tracing its path with my eyes. It wasn't on the boundary. It wasn't even close. It was several feet inside my property line, cutting through land I paid for, cared for, maintained. I crouched down, brushing my fingers through the displaced soil, feeling the violation of it. Then I stood and marched back inside my house, mud sticking to my feet, and went straight for the drawer where I keep my property documents. I spread the survey map across my dining table, the lines crisp, the measurements clear. There was no mistake. The ditch was deep, inside my land. They didn't ask. They didn't notify. They didn't care. As the realization settled in, a cold determination started building in my chest. If Linda thought she could bury this under some fake paperwork, she didn't know me at all. I stepped back outside, heart pounding but steadier now. Linda was already walking away, acting as if the conversation was over. Maybe to her it was. But for me, it was just beginning. I made up my mind right there. I would confront the HOA publicly. I would force them to answer for this. But before I could take a step toward her, a worker approached me, unsure, holding a yellow slip of paper. "This is for you," he said quietly. I unfolded it, a formal notice from the HOA. I was being accused of interfering with HOA construction. Walking into the HOA hall that evening felt like stepping into a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. The moment I pushed open the glass door, every conversation inside dropped into a low whisper. Heads turned. Eyes followed me. Some stared with pity, some with annoyance, and a few with thinly disguised fear. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with heat and tension, as if the overhead vents had given up trying to cool the place. I could feel sweat on my back even though I hadn't been inside for more than 10 seconds. They weren't just here for a meeting. They were here for a spectacle. At the front of the room, behind a long folding table, sat the HOA board. And in the center, like a queen in her throne, was Linda Carver. She wore a smile sharp enough to cut glass, the kind that warned me she had rehearsed this moment. She leaned forward into the microphone and said, "Glad you could join us, Michael." Her tone told me she wasn't glad at all. The meeting started with routine items, but it was obvious everyone was rushing through them to get to the confrontation. When Linda finally announced the agenda point labeled Drainage Improvement Project, all eyes turned to me again. She cleared her throat and immediately launched into her story. "The drainage modifications were approved in advance," she said, glancing at the board members as if signaling them to agree. "I spoke with the homeowner directly. He approved verbally." My jaw tightened. "That's a lie," I said before she could continue, but Linda kept talking over me, raising her voice slightly each time I tried to interrupt. The board members nodded along, their expressions stiff and rehearsed. They looked terrified of disagreeing with her. One of them, a small man on the far right, kept his hands folded tightly as if afraid Linda might bite if he moved. When she finally paused long enough for me to speak, I stood up and held out my phone. "These are the photos I took. Your workers were digging several feet inside my property line, and here," I zoomed in, "is the folder with my name on it. I never signed anything. I never agreed to anything. This entire project is unauthorized." A few board members leaned forward to look, but Linda immediately cut me off. "Irrelevant. The community drainage system must be maintained, and we had approval. You didn't have mine," I said. Linda laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "You agreed verbally. You must have forgotten. That never happened," I replied. She rolled her eyes as if she were dealing with a child. This meeting is not for debating your memory. Every time I tried to clarify something, she talked over me. Every time I tried to show proof, she redirected the conversation. The entire meeting felt like she was tightening a noose around every word I spoke. By the time she dismissed the crowd, I felt drained, furious, but unwilling to back down. Neighbors avoided eye contact as they shuffled out, afraid to be seen supporting me. As chairs scraped and the room emptied, one board member lingered. The same nervous man who had kept his hands folded throughout the meeting walked over slowly, glancing around to make sure Linda wasn't watching. His voice was barely above a whisper when he spoke. "You didn't hear this from me," he said, slipping a folded paper into my hand, "but you need to see it." Before I could ask anything, he hurried out. I unfolded the document under the flickering fluorescent lights. At the top, stamped in bold black ink, were the words that made my stomach drop. Drainage Redirection Plan. Denied by county. The paper trembled slightly in my hand, not because it was light, but because of the weight it carried. Seeing those words stamped across the top, Drainage Redirection Plan. Denied by county, hit me harder than anything Linda had said during the meeting. I stepped outside the HOA hall into the cooler night air, needing space to breathe. Under the yellow parking lot lights, I unfolded the document completely and began reading the attached engineering report. Each line made my jaw clench tighter. The county's engineers had looked at the exact plan Linda pushed through. They had rejected it explicitly because redirecting community runoff into a narrow trench, especially one leading toward a downward-facing slope, posed a serious flooding risk. It could overwhelm soil, destabilize ground, and threaten structural foundation. In plain terms, it could ruin homes. The report even recommended exploring alternative drainage paths that did not affect private properties. My home was the risk they warned about. My foundation, my crawl space, my land. She knew. She had this report in her hands at some point. She read it, or at least skimmed it, saw the red warnings, and still forced workers to dig that ditch. The realization settled over me like cold water poured down my spine. She hadn't made a mistake. She hadn't misunderstood. She had deliberately ignored county orders and put my property in danger because she wanted control and didn't think anyone would fight her. I leaned against my truck, the paper crinkling between my fingers. The smell of motor oil and warm asphalt filled my nose as I tried to steady my breathing. Anger burned beneath my ribs, but beneath that was something heavier. Fear. Real fear. For my home. For the one place in this world I had built with my own hands. I imagined rain pouring into that trench, rushing straight toward my foundation, soaking soil, loosening earth. I imagined waking up to the sound of water seeping under my floors, or worse, part of my yard collapsing. I forced myself to refocus and kept reading the report, scanning for anything else that mattered. Halfway through the second page, a statement stood out like a warning flare. No property alterations or drainage changes may occur without the explicit written consent of the affected homeowner. There it was, the line that turned my frustration into something sharper and clearer. Linda hadn't just ignored the county. She had violated property law, and every ounce of rage I felt now had a backbone of undeniable proof. I folded the document carefully, placing it inside a folder I kept in my truck for important papers. Losing it wasn't an option. This wasn't just evidence. It was the truth she had buried. But as I pulled out my phone to take pictures for backup, another notification appeared across the top of the screen. A red bar. A loud vibration. A short alert tone that cut through the quiet night. A weather advisory. I tapped it open, my breath held in my chest. Severe rainfall expected within the next 24 hours. Flood risk advisory in effect. My stomach tightened. The timing couldn't have been worse. The ditch in my yard wasn't finished. The ground was already torn open. If the storm hit, the runoff would surge through that trench like a river with nowhere to go except toward my home. I looked back toward my house in the distance, dark and silent against the sky, and a single chilling thought settled in. If I didn't act soon, that storm might destroy everything I owned. The storm didn't arrive gently. It struck like a hammer. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of bruised steel, and within minutes the clouds split open. Sheets of rain slammed against my roof with a force that made the walls vibrate. I stepped onto my porch, and the wind almost pushed me back. The scent of wet earth was overwhelming, thick and heavy, mixed with that sharp mineral smell mud releases when it's torn open. My yard, still wounded from the ditch, was already pooling with water. The trench carved by the HOA, raw and unfinished, was turning into a fast-moving channel. Cold droplets pelted my face as I hurried to the side of the house, gripping the railing so I wouldn't slip. The rain was roaring so loudly it drowned out every other sound, and for a moment, all I could see was water surging through the narrow cut, gaining speed, carrying mud and debris straight toward my home. The ditch wasn't guiding water, it was funneling it like a weapon. I stepped into the yard and felt icy water immediately flood over my ankles. The soil had turned to sludge, sucking at my shoes as I pushed forward. I followed the current with my eyes, heart racing, until I saw it spill over the edge and collect at the entrance of my crawl space. The dark opening beneath my house gurgled as water rushed inside. My stomach twisted. This was exactly what the county engineers warned about. This was exactly what Linda ignored. I crouched down, trying to see how deep the water had gone, and the cold splash hit my palms as the runoff forced its way deeper. It smelled of torn earth, mold, and something metallic. My mind flashed to the wiring, the insulation, the beams. Water inside a crawlspace doesn't stay there. It rises, it spreads, it destroys. A sudden gust of wind made me look up, and that's when I saw her. Linda Carver stood on the sidewalk under a large black umbrella, perfectly dry, watching my yard flood like it was a show put on for her entertainment. Her expression wasn't shock, or concern, or even discomfort. It was satisfaction, a tiny, unmistakable curl at the corner of her mouth, like she was confirming something she had predicted. The rain battered her umbrella, lightning flashed behind her, and still she didn't look away. She wanted me to see this. She wanted me to know she believed she was untouchable. I wanted to shout something at her, anything, but the storm swallowed my voice. Instead, I turned back toward the crawl space, panic tightening around my ribs. If the water reached my foundation beams, the damage wouldn't just be expensive, it would be catastrophic. I needed help, and I needed it fast. I stumbled back toward the porch, almost slipping as the mud gave way beneath my feet. Inside the house, I grabbed my phone, hands shaking, and dialed the county inspector's emergency line. Each ring felt like an eternity. When the voicemail kicked in, I ended the call and tried his direct number. Then the main office. Then the on-call technician. Rain blasted the windows so hard it sounded like gravel, and with every second that passed, I could feel the water rising outside. I finally reached someone, an emergency dispatcher for the county utilities department. I shouted into the phone over the noise, explaining the ditch, the runoff, the denied plan, and the storm tearing my property apart. She promised to alert the inspector immediately and have someone sent out, but even through the static, I could hear hesitation. Storm nights always overload the system. I ended the call and rushed back outside, desperate to assess the damage again. But when I rounded the corner, my breath caught in my throat. Near the base of my foundation, where the soil had been weakening all day, a chunk of earth had collapsed inward. A small sinkhole was forming. I was still staring at the sinkhole forming near my foundation when headlights cut through the storm. A white county truck rolled to a stop in front of my house, windshield wipers thrashing against the sheets of rain. The door swung open and a man in a reflective jacket stepped out, shielding a clipboard under his arm as he jogged toward me. Even through the darkness and the storm, I could see the urgency in his pace. "Michael Reed?" he shouted over the rain. "Yes," I yelled back. He nodded quickly. "Daniel Hoffman, County Inspections. Dispatch called me in." He followed my hand as I pointed toward the ditch, and the twisted expression on his face told me he already knew this was worse than he had been briefed. Rain plastered his hair to his forehead as he knelt near the collapsing soil. "This is bad," he muttered. "This is exactly what we warned the HOA about." My heart hammered harder. So the county really did deny the plan. Hoffman almost laughed, but it wasn't amusement. It was disbelief. Denied twice. The first submission was sloppy. The second was rejected because the HOA insisted on routing water through private property without written consent. He looked at me directly, rain running down his cheeks. "They cannot redirect runoff onto your land. That's illegal. HOA or not." Hearing it out loud, from a county official, made something in my chest loosen. Not relief, not yet. But validation. I wasn't crazy. I hadn't overreacted. Linda wasn't allowed to do what she did. Hoffman stood and walked along the ditch line, his boots sinking into the mud as he studied the path of the runoff. Every few steps he shook his head. "They built a channel designed to funnel half the community's stormwater directly toward your house. This violates county drainage code and state runoff laws." Then he added, "She did this intentionally. There's no way she didn't know." I swallowed hard. "She claimed I approved it verbally." He stopped walking, slowly turned around, stared at me like I'd told him the sky was green. "She's used that excuse before," he said. "You're not the first. She's been warned for overstepping authority multiple times." He let out a sharp breath. I should have known she'd try something again. Hoffman walked back toward the sinkhole and crouched to examine the shifting soil. Thunder cracked so loudly it rattled the ground. He raised his voice over the storm. "Here's the law you need to know. Any alteration that changes water flow must have written consent from affected homeowners. No exceptions, no verbal agreements. And the HOA has zero right to modify drainage on your land without documented approval." Hearing those words gave me something I hadn't felt since this nightmare started. A sense of control. "So what do I do?" I asked. Hoffman wiped rain from his face and straightened up. "You stop the flow. Legally." He pointed back toward his truck. "I'm issuing a temporary cease-flow order. That gives you the right to block any unauthorized runoff entering your property until the county completes a full investigation." My breath hitched. "You mean I can shut this whole thing off?" "You can," he said, "and I recommend you do. Tonight." He began filling out the paperwork on his clipboard, ink smearing slightly from the rain. When he finished, he tore the top copy free and handed it to me. "This protects you from any HOA retaliation. They can't fine you. They can't threaten you. They can't override this order." Lightning flashed, illuminating the yard in a harsh white glow, and that's when both of us looked up. Across the street, under her umbrella again, stood Linda Carver, staring, watching, unmoving. Hoffman narrowed his eyes. "She's heard every word," he said, and then, before he even walked back to his truck, Linda shouted through the storm, "I'm not stopping anything." She refused to follow the order. For the first time since this nightmare started, I felt something shift inside me. Not fear, not anger, but resolve. I finally had the legal authority to fight back. The cease-flow order wasn't just a document. It was a shield. And standing there in the storm with Inspector Hoffman, watching Linda glare at us from across the street, I realized she no longer held all the power. I did. Hoffman followed me around the side of the house where the trench cut deep into the soaked soil. Rainwater still rushed through it, but slower now as the storm began to ease. He crouched beside the ditch and motioned for me to join him. "This isn't just your runoff," he said, tracing a gloved hand along the carved channel. "Look at the depth. Look at the angle. This was designed to carry a large volume." I felt a chill, despite the humidity. "You mean the whole street?" "Not the street," Hoffman corrected. "At least half the community." He pointed to the direction uphill. "They connected the neighborhood's secondary overflow line to this ditch. Illegally." The words hit me harder than the storm had. The HOA didn't just dump a little water onto my land. They built a pipeline to shove the community's problems straight toward my home. Why my property? I asked quietly. Hoffman shook his head. Because it was convenient, and because your section of the boundary doesn't have county surveillance markers. They probably assumed no one would notice. I clenched my jaw. They chose me because they thought I was the easiest target. We walked the length of the ditch, mapping the angles and identifying the points where I could safely cut the water flow without damaging legitimate systems. He explained where barriers would hold, where sandbags would shift the current, and where temporary valves could redirect the overflow until the county conducted a full inspection. Back under the cover of my porch, he drew the plan on a piece of waterproof paper. A clean, simple diagram. A route to take back control of my own property. You do this, he said, tapping the finished sketch, and you'll be fully within your rights. The HOA can't touch you. The storm had weakened enough for me to drive. I grabbed my keys and sped to the hardware store before they closed, still soaked, shoes caked with mud. I loaded my truck with barriers, sandbags, temporary flow valves, stakes, rope, and floodlights. The clerk looked at me like I was preparing for a hurricane. In a way, I was. When I got home, 2 neighbors were waiting under their porch awning, Tom and Rachel Miller. They glanced at the equipment in the truck bed, then at the trench. Rachel lowered her voice. We heard what happened. Are you really shutting it off? I nodded. Tom exhaled sharply. Good. Someone needed to stand up to her. But even as they spoke, both kept glancing around nervously, afraid Linda might appear. She had conditioned the whole neighborhood to fear her authority. But tonight, I wasn't backing down, and quietly, cautiously, both of them offered to help me move sandbags into position. For the next hour, with the storm pausing overhead, we prepared. We set up barriers, tested valve positions, and positioned sandbags where Hoffman indicated they'd be most effective. By the time we finished, my yard looked like a battlefield waiting for its next assault. As I walked Tom and Rachel back to their door, my phone buzzed. A severe weather notification flashed across the screen. Major storm front approaching. Expected to be larger than previous system. I stared up at the sky, now eerily calm. The real fight was coming. The night before the storm felt nothing like the chaos that had torn through my yard earlier. It was too still. Too quiet. The kind of silence that feels like the world is taking one long breath before everything breaks loose. I stepped outside with a flashlight and the temperature hit me first. Sharp, cold air rolling across the yard, carrying the faint metallic smell that always comes before heavy rain. The ditch, the sinkhole, the yazmaka, barriers we had placed earlier, all sat in that eerie stillness like pieces on a board waiting for the first move. I tightened the last valve connection, hearing the metallic click echo softly in the night. The sound felt oddly final, like I had just locked something into place that couldn't be undone. I adjusted the sandbags along the trench, pushing them deeper into the mud so they wouldn't shift when the water hit. Every movement felt heavier, like the air itself resisted me. A low rumble of thunder rolled far in the distance, long and slow, warning me the storm was gathering strength. As I checked the last floodlight, I let myself pause for the first time in hours. My hands were shaking, not from cold, but from the weight of everything that had happened. I thought about the folder with my name forged on it, the trench ripping through my yard, the water rushing into my crawl space, and the look in Linda Carver's eyes as she watched it all unfold, like she had orchestrated every second. For years, people in this neighborhood had whispered about her, feared her, avoided her, let her push them around, and I had almost done the same. Almost. But standing in the cold night air, listening to thunder inch closer, I knew why I wasn't backing down. I had worked years to buy this home. I had built memories here, and I wasn't going to let a bully in a tailored blazer and HOA badge destroy what I built. A soft voice broke the silence behind me. Need anything? I turned to see Tom standing at the edge of his porch, arms wrapped around himself. He tried to sound casual, but I heard the worry beneath it. "We're good," I said quietly. "Just waiting now." A moment later, Rachel stepped out, handing me a thermos. "It's hot. You'll need it tonight." She didn't stay long, as if scared someone might see the interaction, but her gesture told me everything. People were tired of Linda too. They were just waiting for someone to take the first step. I walked back into my yard and set the thermos beside the toolbox. The moon slipped behind thickening clouds, and the world dimmed. The wind picked up, rustling the trees, pushing waves across the surface of the mud. I checked the barriers again, tied the ropes tighter, tested the valves for the 5th time. Anything to keep my hands busy because the waiting was worse than the work. Thunder cracked again, closer this time. The kind that vibrates in your chest. The early edge of the storm brushed over the rooftops, a smear of gray spreading across the sky. I could feel the shift, pressure dropping, wind bending sideways, the quiet of the night replaced by a tense hum. I stepped back, took one long breath and looked down the length of my yard. Everything was in place. Every tool, every barrier, every contingency. I wasn't just defending my home. I was taking it back. Then, without warning, the sky tore open. A massive lightning strike split the darkness, blinding white, cracking so loud. The ground trembled beneath my feet. This was the moment. The storm returned with a vengeance. Rain came down so hard it felt like needles hitting my skin as I ran across the yard, flashlight bobbing in my hand. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the ground, and the wind howled so fiercely it made the trees bend like they were bowing to something bigger than all of us. This was the moment I had prepared for. This was the moment Daniel Hoffman's cease-flow order empowered me to act. And as the runoff roared toward my property like a living thing, I finally took control. The trench filled frighteningly fast, water surging down from the higher streets, carrying dirt, branches, and trash with it. I waded into the flood, my boots sinking deep into the mud, and grabbed hold of the first valve. Cold water splashed against my chest as I twisted it into place. The metal groaned under the pressure, but it held. I secured the second valve, then the third, each one tightening the choke on the illegal path the HOA had carved. The roar of moving water shifted pitch, less like a river, more like a strangled rush. As the flow slowed, then split, then redirected away from my home, I moved quickly, hauling sandbags into the remaining gap, stacking them until they formed a solid barrier. Rain hammered my back. Wind tore at my jacket. The ditch bucked like it was fighting me, water searching for any route it could steal. But the county-approved system held firm. When I wedged the final bag into place, the water finally gave way, backing up the trench, no longer racing toward my foundation. For the first time since this nightmare began, the danger wasn't aimed at my home. It was aimed at the HOAs. Within minutes, the redirected runoff overflowed into the common areas behind the clubhouse. Water pooled across their newly landscaped walking path. Streams poured through their flower beds. The decorative mulch they bragged about for months lifted like drifting islands. What had been intended for my crawl space was now flooding the areas they claimed were properly maintained. And that's when I heard her. Over the roar of the storm, a shrill voice cut through the night. "Michael Reed, you stop that right now." I turned to see Linda charging down her driveway, umbrella flipping inside out in the wind. She looked wild, hair plastered to her face, shoes sinking into the mud with each furious step. "You're destroying HOA property," she screamed, pointing at the backup flooding their grounds. "You'll pay for this." I held up the laminated cease-flow order, the county seal visible even through the rain. "I'm following the law. You're the one who ignored it." She didn't want to hear a word. She pushed forward, almost slipping, yelling louder, her voice cracking under the weight of fury and panic. "You can't do this. You can't block community systems." Neighbors stepped onto their porches despite the storm, drawn by the shouting. One by one, they watched the scene unfold. Their eyes darted. Between the rising water, the barriers I'd built, and Linda's unraveling composure, some whispered to each other. Some simply stood in stunned silence. Tom and Rachel appeared again, standing close enough to show they were with me, even if quietly. And that was enough to send Linda over the edge. She pulled out her phone, rain dripping down her arm. "I'm calling the police," she screeched. "You'll be arrested for property damage." I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I simply watched her make the call, her voice cracking with desperation. She wanted a war. But what she didn't expect was what happened next. Minutes later, through the sheets of rain, red and blue lights flickered across the flooded street. The flashing red and blue lights bounced across the flooded pavement, reflecting off the water like broken shards of color. My heart pounded, but not from fear. This time it was something steadier, something grounded. I had every document I needed. I had the truth. And as the police cruiser rolled to a stop, spraying water outward, I wiped the rain from my face and readied myself. 2 officers stepped out, jackets pulled tight against the storm, hands on their belts as they approached. The wind twisted their voices, but their tone was unmistakably firm. "Sir, we received a report of property damage and obstruction of HOA infrastructure. Are you Michael Reed?" I nodded. "Yes, I am." Before I could say more, Linda rushed forward, rainwater streaming off her ruined umbrella. "Arrest him!" she shouted, pointing at me like she was commanding soldiers. "He sabotaged the entire community drainage system. Look, the clubhouse is underwater." One officer raised a hand, stopping her. "Ma'am, we'll speak with you in a moment." She tried to argue, but they turned toward me first, their expressions serious. "Sir, we need to understand what's happening. Why is the runoff blocked?" The moment felt strangely calm. I pulled the waterproof folder from inside my jacket, opened it carefully, and held out each document with deliberate clarity. "Because the county ordered me to block it," I said. "This is the cease-flow order issued by Inspector Daniel Hoffman." I handed them the page with the county seal and Hoffman's signature. "Here's the denied drainage plan that the HOA submitted. And this," I unfolded the property survey, "shows the ditch was dug several feet inside my boundary without my consent." Both officers leaned in, checking every page, flipping between them as rain streaked across their hats. Their faces shifted, from suspicion to confusion to understanding. They stepped aside to confer quietly, turning pages under the light of the flood lamp attached to the cruiser. Linda paced behind them, sputtering, shaking her head violently. "He forged that. He's lying. He approved it verbally. Everyone knows that." One officer turned sharply toward her. "Ma'am, that's not how property authorization works. Verbal consent does not override written law." He pointed at the survey. "And this ditch clearly crosses onto his property." Linda's face twisted in anger. "You don't understand. He agreed. He said yes during a conversation." "He doesn't need to say anything," the officer cut in. "Homeowners have absolute rights over their property boundaries. No HOA can alter private land without written consent. Period." Hearing that, the law spoken plainly in the cold rain, in front of half the neighborhood, felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders. Neighbors watching from porches exchanged glances. Even over the storm, I could feel a shift. People were seeing the truth with their own eyes. Linda tried again, voice cracking now, desperation creeping in. "This is a misunderstanding." The other officer stepped closer to her. "Ma'am, did you notify the county before starting this project?" She hesitated, just for a second, but that second told the whole story. "No further questions," the officer said, turning back to me. "Mr. Reed, you followed county orders. You're acting within your rights. We won't be taking any action against you." Linda's mouth hung open, stunned. The storm raged, but the moment between us was silent. She had just been exposed, publicly, undeniably. Before anyone could speak again, another set of bright lights cut through the darkness. A large county emergency truck turned the corner, engine rumbling as it pulled up right behind the police cars. The doors swung open. Reinforcements had arrived. The storm eased just before dawn, leaving the world washed, bruised, and strangely quiet. The sky turned a pale gray as the county emergency truck idled behind the police cruisers, its headlights slicing through the mist that lingered above the soaked earth. I stood there shivering in the cold morning air, exhausted but alert, watching as the county officials stepped out dressed in waterproof gear and heavy boots. They carried clipboards, survey tools, and an authority that even Linda couldn't shout her way past. Without wasting a second, they began inspecting the trench, the backup flooding, the sinkhole, and the destroyed path of runoff. Their expressions changed with every step. First confusion, then disbelief, and finally outrage. One of the officials crouched near the ditch and ran his fingers through the rushing water. They really tied the community overflow into this? He muttered, almost to himself. This violates every guideline we gave them. Another official walked the length of the ditch, boots sinking into mud, and shook his head. Shut it down, he said firmly. All of it. Those 3 words struck me harder than any thunderclap the storm had thrown at us. They didn't hesitate. Within minutes, county workers were placing temporary blocks on every connection point the HOA had illegally rerouted. They used heavy rubber barriers, metal plates, and industrial clamps to sever the unauthorized flow. The water redirected through proper county systems, ones built to handle storms, not makeshift trenches carved into private property. I glanced toward Linda, who was standing near the clubhouse steps with her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her face was pale, her jaw clenched so hard I could see the tension from across the street. For once, she wasn't talking. She wasn't screaming. She was watching her authority crumble right in front of her. The lead county official approached her, paperwork in hand. "Ms. Carver," he said, voice firm, "the HOA is being cited for unauthorized infrastructure modification, violation of county drainage law, and endangerment of private property. Fines will be issued immediately. A formal investigation starts today." Neighbors had gathered by now, some still in pajamas, some bundled in coats, all exhausted from the long night. But when they heard the county's verdict, a wave of relief rippled through the crowd. People exchanged looks that said what they hadn't dared say aloud for years. Finally, later that afternoon, an emergency HOA meeting was held, this time without Linda controlling the microphone. I didn't attend, but I didn't have to. Word spread fast. By majority vote, Linda Carver was removed as president. The board, tired of being dragged into her messes, stripped her of all decision-making authority. She stormed out of the meeting red-faced, refusing to speak to anyone. When the officials left and the police finally pulled away, I walked the yard in the settling light. The damage was real. My garden was torn apart. My crawl space had taken on water. The soil near my foundation was unstable, but my home was standing, and for the first time in days the danger felt like it was finally receding. Neighbors approached one by one, offering thanks, apologies, and help. Tom clapped a hand on my shoulder. Rachel hugged me tightly. Others nodded with a kind of quiet respect. They had lived under her shadow for so long that seeing someone stand up to her and win felt like a shift in the entire neighborhood. Life, slowly, began returning to normal in the days that followed. The county promised repairs. Inspectors kept visiting to monitor the soil. And for the first time, the HOA stopped sending letters to my mailbox. But peace didn't last long. One evening, as I stepped onto my porch, I noticed an envelope taped to my front door. My name scrawled on the front in tight, angry handwriting. Inside was a single line, written in shaky ink. "I will get my position back." Linda wasn't done yet. Even though the storm had passed and the county had officially shut down the illegal drainage system, the emotional weight of everything lingered with me. It's strange how silence can feel heavier than chaos. For days after, I'd step into my yard and still expect to hear the roar of rushing water or see fresh damage waiting. For me, instead, I heard only the soft sounds of workers assessing repairs, the low hum of machinery, and the steady drip of water drying under the warmer sun. But inside, a part of me was still bracing for something to go wrong. When you've spent days fighting to protect your home, your mind doesn't immediately believe you're safe. The county wasted no time rebuilding the drainage correctly. They rerouted the overflow to proper channels, installed reinforced runoff grates, and filled the sinkhole near my foundation with stabilized soil. Watching them work was like watching someone stitch up a wound, seeing the broken pieces come together again, slowly but with purpose. Every day they showed progress, and every day I felt the knot in my chest loosen a little more. My yard looked like a recovery project, but it finally felt like one moving in the right direction. Of course, Linda couldn't leave things alone. Even after losing her position, facing fines, and being publicly exposed, she filed one last complaint, claiming I willfully sabotaged essential HOA infrastructure and damaged community property. She sent it directly to the county. I didn't even know about it until a county official lightly laughed and showed me the dismissal notice. They had marked her complaint as invalid, retaliatory, and without merit. That sentence alone felt like the final nail in the coffin of her influence. With the repairs underway and Linda officially sidelined, I finally had space to think about everything that had happened. Standing in my yard one morning, coffee in hand, watching the soil dry and the new drainage line settle, I realized something I should have known from the start. No homeowner should ever feel powerless on their own property. A title, a badge, or an HOA position doesn't give anyone the right to trample over your rights, your boundaries, or your home. And if there's one lesson I learned through this ordeal, it's this: know your documents, know your lines, and never let intimidation convince you that you're smaller than you are. It's easy to ignore a bully until they're digging a ditch through your life. But when you stand your ground, calmly, firmly, with facts, they lose the power they thought they had. To everyone watching, if you've ever faced something like this, tell me your story. Drop it in the comments. And if you'd stand up for your property the way I had to stand up for mine, hit the like button. Subscribe for more stories just like this one. And share this video with anyone dealing with an impossible HOA. You never know who might need to hear it. Because the truth is, this wasn't the end for me. Not even close. Just a few weeks after the drainage disaster settled, I heard a knock on my door. It was a neighbor I barely knew, eyes wide, holding a stack of letters the HOA had sent him. Letters that didn't make sense. Letters that looked far too familiar. He needed help. And just like that, I found myself pulled right back into HOA chaos.